Welcome back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only show to take place right here in the space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Brendan Hansen.
I'm Jake Friedman.
And this is the podcast about decisions in games.
And today we're talking about, in my opinion, the best mechanism in all of board games, drawing cards. Everybody agrees drawing cards is incredibly fun. And that's a big statement because in this hobby, in this community, it's really hard to find agreement on almost anything. Some people hate worker placement games. Some people hate games with dice randomness. Some people hate deck building games, etc. But I've literally never heard anybody ever say, I don't like when I draw cards in games. And that's what we're talking about today. So it should be a real crowd pleaser.
So what's fun about drawing cards and what's sort of the design space? What about it really makes a game potentially pop?
We're going to do it in two parts. So the first part is going to be what is fun about drawing cards, and then we're going to take a slightly nuanced look at that and you put our game design hats on and say, how can games be designed so that drawing cards are fun? Look at some of the knobs that we can turn, that designers turn to help us understand what about this card drawing mechanism makes it so great.
Yeah, I'm so excited. Cards are my favorite object to play games with, period, right? It's just, I love board games, but a board game with cards, almost always I tend to prefer for a lot of the reasons that I think we'll get to. But where do you want to start with this, Jake? Because I agree they're intrinsically fun. But
all right, well, before we jump into that, really quick housekeeping. I have to say, please review this podcast. We are patiently waiting new reviews so we can read them out. If you're reviewing our podcast in a place that's not like Apple Podcast in the United States, you could also shoot us an email or let us know on Discord so that you've left us a review so that we can read it out on the show. We'd love to do that. Please join our Discord. So much of the notes that I prepared for this episode came directly from Discord members contributing in our pre-planner channel, which is so great. A fun discussion there. So I'm going to try and shout people out who helped contribute to the show. So join our Discord. And then thing number 3, if you'd like to support us, we have a Patreon for this show, and your support would go a tremendous way there as well.
Awesome. So Jake, what's fun about drawing cards? So should we start with a fun moment of drawing cards that you've had recently that's memorable? Do you have a memorable moment of drawing cards from recently?
That's a great question. Do you have one on the top of your head? Yeah, you go first. I'll think. So going off script already. I prepare notes for the first time in 200 episodes.
Now you know how it feels.
And Brendan just instantly goes off script. Something I would never do.
So Jake, you and I both really enjoy Keyforge, a Richard Garfield card game. Keyforge is old now, Jake. Do you know it's almost retro? This is not but anyway, it's this card game where you have a 36 card deck with these 3 different houses, and it's a dueling card game. You're going against someone else. And I found myself playing a game of Keyforge, Jake, where I was playing this really cool deck that was all about stealing my opponent's amber. That you're trying to forge these 3 keys. You need to get to 6 amber. If you have 6 amber at the start of your turn, you forge a key. But there's a number of cards that are called key cheats that let you forge keys immediately, usually for a little bit higher cost. So I was playing this deck, Jake, and I'll tell you, because you know Keyforge fairly well, it was all about trying to get ahead by 1 key, playing the sting. The sting says whenever your opponent forges a key, you get all their amber. And then playing a key charge or a Chota Hazri, which is this creature that also is just a key cheat. Same thing as a key charge. You get to forge a key at current cost +1. So it's all about get ahead by 1 key, play the sting, and then just wait for your opponent to forge a key or 2. Use their amber to forge your own keys and win the game. So I got myself into a position where I had carefully used my Logos cards to archive all of my key cheats. I archive a Chota Hazri, so I had 1. And I got myself into a pickle where basically the end of the game was coming. I had no way to disrupt my opponent's plan. And I had a really big turn that set me up. I had enough amber, but I was keys behind. So I needed to draw one of my 2 key cheats, and I could win the game, forging 2 keys in a single turn and beating my opponent, basically stealing the game out from under them. And as I was playing, this line became clearer and clearer. Okay, I've set this up, but I have to draw this card. My only out to potentially win this game. I can't get my opponent off being above 6 amber. I can't steal their amber. I can't, stop them from forging for a turn. My only out is drawing this key charge. So I chose a house that was not necessarily the best house, but it was the house that was going to set me up to draw the most cards. Kind of said, okay, here I go. This is my one out. Then I went to draw, and lo and behold, the key charge was sitting there, and I was able to win the game off this sort of plan that had come together. And it was this incredibly fun moment where I had set this up for almost the entire game. It came down to this one dramatic, will I draw the right card moment. It was sitting there out of maybe 10 cards that I could have drawn, and it was delightful.
That is excellent example of so much that makes drawing cards fun, I think, is in that story. So I
Yeah.
want our listeners just to kind of hold that as much as you can as we talk through some of the elements that make drawing cards fun. And I think you'll kind of see a lot of the same things, a bunch of different things present in that story. We're going to try and pull them out in this conversation. So I'll save I'll be talking a lot of examples in this episode. So let's just transition right into the first one, which I think is the core of that story that you told, which is the first thing that came to mind when I think about what is fun about drawing cards, is that they provide an emergent narrative, right? That you told us a story,
Yep.
and games aren't always the best conduits of stories. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. Um, but I think that story of like, I needed this thing to happen, right? It has all of the hallmarks of storytelling, right? There's the setup, the rising action, the climax. Like, do you draw the card or not? And it's like, okay, cool, I draw the card. Now I'm gonna like resolve the rest of the story because I won the
Yeah.
game, and
Yeah.
everyone lived happily ever after. Like, it really, just the simple act of drawing cards. Am I going to get what I need? Am I not going to get what I need? Like, really does hit this, like, I think, crucial uh narrative story arc
And I
in there.
think you used a phrase, Jake, that is important, a cultural phrase that comes from Yu-Gi-Oh, but heart of the cards storytelling. Did you say that
Yeah, I
already?
see it's here in the notes. Yeah.
Okay. So this is a phrase, right, that comes from a anime series about playing card games, that I think has culturally, at least within nerd culture, that's a phrase that people know. Believe in the heart of the cards. And I think it's illustrative because you also in the notes have, Jake, is this different or better than rolling a mini-sided die for outcome? So in my example, right, there's 10 cards I can draw. I only need one of them. Literally one of those 10 has to be the right card. And I had 4 or 5 chances at it. Versus if I roll a 20-sided die, and I have to, if I roll 1 through 5 or 1 through 10, I'm going to hit or something. It's not the same, but it's about in that area. And I think for me, this phrase, believing in the heart of the cards, and this illustrated example of, is this a better vehicle for storytelling than rolling a die? There's this, it doesn't matter, but it feels, because the cards are shuffled and they're sitting there on the table, that there is some predestined outcome, and that you are resolving some prearranged way in which the world was, that you are discovering as you draw, that I know whenever I draw, right? It's just random. It was shuffled, it was decided, but it is random. It is opaque to me until it happens. But it feels different that it's decided at some point, and then I am making behavior based on knowledge I don't have that does exist. Someone could pick the deck up and see if my choices were right and wrong. Somehow that feels meaningfully different to me and more dramatic,
Yeah,
which is silly, but it's true for me.
totally. I too am a child of the Yu-Gi-Oh anime, or as I
Yes.
would have called it, as you
Cartoon.
know, an 8-year-old, a cartoon
Yeah.
that literally aired Saturday mornings.
Mm.
Which, as kids of the '90s, that was a thing. Not as much anymore.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I think that is something, that sort of belief in the heart of the cards, that story, that's kind of a theme that repeats throughout that show, is something that I just like adopted wholesale as I was starting to learn how to play card games like Yu-Gi-Oh, like Pokemon the card game, like Magic the Gathering. I have memories of being like an obnoxious kid at Friday Night Magic. Like on my knees on the chair, like knocking with my knuckles on the top of the deck, just hoping that my uh, you know Goblin Pile Driver was going to be like the top card of my deck to win me the game. Uh, yeah, and kind of like that, believing that it was, in some ways predestined in a way that uh, drawing cards. I love what you said there, right? It feels like you're kind of unrevealing a story, whereas like
Yeah.
rolling dice feels a little bit more like each being a discrete moment of randomness, even if they're not functionally very similar. Or I mean, and there are differences there, right? Like, and we'll talk more about that later on in the designing, where yeah, you aren't going to draw the same exact card over and over in the way that you could with dice, but functionally in games, often they would work out as the same type of input randomness. The
Yeah.
last thing I wanted to say on the story beat of drawing cards is, even when they don't tell a great story at the end of the game, which you were talking about with your Keyforge story, they can also help us tell stories to ourselves during the game, where
Mhm.
as long as you can see the possibility, a line of cards, if I draw just these two cards in a row, or if I draw these three cards over my next, 10 turns before the game's over, I have a real chance in this game. Like, it allows you to tell stories, even if it's like a lie or an exaggeration, that like you're still in the game in a way that, uh, you know, games without decks of cards, that aren't driven by decks of cards in the way that Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh and Keyforge is, often it's much more difficult to tell that story to yourself of how you're going to get back in the game, making that experience of playing out a game from a losing position less exciting without that card draw.
Yeah. And I think a base level fun aspect here too, right? In my story, it's the perfect example because I drew the exact right card. But even at its most baseline level, getting things feels good, right? We know that as humans, psychology, right? Loss aversion is a thing. Losing things feels bad. We are averse to losing things if we have them, and getting new things feels good. So when you're playing a card game, typically, especially if you are drawing cards, there's a deck of face down cards that you do not have. And then periodically in the games, you just get new things. And getting new things feels empowering, especially in card games, because often you're getting access to the ability to do new things. And that just on a basic level feels great. But when you have that moment, like in my Keyforge game, where there's something specific you want, then you have this moment where it's almost like being a kid on Christmas, right?
Yeah.
I really hope, my key charge is in this box. And then you get to open the box 4 times if you're drawing 4 cards and see if you kind of got that gift. For me, it feels emotionally like that. In those moments where I have that little joy, it's this ideation, hope, and then if it happens, this actualization of a plan, they can also feel like solving a puzzle, right? In that Keyforge situation, I had to think to myself, okay, I'm analyzing the game state. What are the ways that I could win this game? Maybe not the right on the final turn, but a few turns before. It became clear there's only one way I can win this game, right? So
Yeah.
I've solved a puzzle in my head, and then I get to see if I can find the piece through drawing a card.
Very, very satisfying feeling of
Yeah.
gameplay when that comes together. And even when it doesn't, right? Um, you still are there. Like, you're more maybe present in the game than you would be in a different type of game.
Yeah,
Um,
and you get to feel good when you think about it and you draw the card, you feel smart because you thought that could be coming. But if it doesn't come, then you get to feel great because it was just random and you
yeah.
lost because of random chance in the
Well,
way that you might not feel with dice.
yeah. And let's go to another point about why drawing cards is so fun. I think you're hitting on with that. It feels like a gift. It feels, you're getting new ways to interact with the game. And I think that more so than many other mechanisms, drawing cards can make you feel powerful. And that's because when you design a deck of cards, uh, jumping to the next part of the conversation, right? You can design cards that are just like absolutely overpowered. In
Mm,
your story that you told, that key cheat card might as
yeah.
well have said, "You win the game,"
Sure. Yes.
because
Yeah.
of the situation um, that you had created through that line of play, through all the other events in the game. If you draw that card, you win the game. If you don't draw that card, you lose the game,
Right.
presumably. And it's so, having that in a game is almost always manifests. I've found, right, through cards or drawing something. It could be a tile, whatever. We're kind of
Yeah.
lumping that together here, but those moments where it's like, I'm either going to win the game or not here, or like I draw something and then realize I've either won the game or like I've drawn the exact thing, and I keep doing a drawing motion with my hand.
Sure.
I've drawn the exact thing that puts me in such a commanding position in this game, it gives you a sense of can give you a sense of power like few other mechanisms that must, by virtue of being like actions on the board or actions that players always have access to,
Yeah.
must be more inherently balanced than a deck of cards, which can be balanced in all these other different ways.
Right. Playing chess, you always, as long as your queen is on the board, you always have access to the queen. And she's
Mhm.
always going to do the same things. And yeah, that's really interesting. That because it's sort of cards can represent sort of new potential, that yeah, you feel this burst of power when you draw the right thing. That's a really good point. And sort of the ebbing and flowing of your toolkit. At that moment too, Jake, when you take a card, you draw it and look at it, something that I think is innately fun about drawing cards is that cards often have art on them. They have thematic immersion. So you have both, you are just visually treated aesthetically to something cool often to look at. And I think that can be fun too. It can be fun in the moment where you flip it over. Okay, you see, oh, it's of the right house, but is it the exact card I need? And oftentimes I find I'm seeing the art before I'm even seeing the text on a card, right? That's how we visually read cards often with art before we read the text on them. And I think that that can be even emotionally an exciting moment. And then also, if it's a calm moment throughout the game, it's just fun. You get new things to look at. There's usually a lot to engage with on a card that has art on it. And if it's a number, this is less so a thing, but it could
Yeah.
be from the color.
Yeah, we're big mechanical people
Yeah.
here on Decision Space. So we don't talk as much as we should about art and kind of
Yeah.
theme, but I think part of the reason, we get excited, whether it's stated or not, when we're digging into a new game that has 300 cards or whatever, is that's 300 pictures also
Sure.
in
Yeah.
many cases. Not so much Pete's trick taking games, though sometimes those have delightful art too, I
Yep.
will admit. But, in a lot of these games, right, every single card is a canvas. It's like the opportunity for the publishers and developers and designers, to get their heads together and express something about the game. So, we talked about like the emergent narrative of the mechanisms, but it
Yeah.
also provides that kind of thematic story that goes along to it that meant more to me as a kid probably than it did now, where I could
Sure.
kind of imagine the epic battles that was taking place on my table. I,
Yep.
sadly, perhaps, I'm not doing that as much now, but I do think that is a big part of the magic of drawing cards is getting that new
Sure.
picture, getting that new piece of theme,
Yep.
and the fact that, to go to our next point, Brenda, is like that it's just for you.
Mm. That cards are hidden information that you're acquiring. It's a secret that you're learning that you haven't yet enacted on the game state in some ways. When you
Yeah,
draw a face down card, you now know something about the game state that no one else at the table knows until you reveal it.
right. I think we've all had that moment where you draw a card that's just so juicy based on the game state that you just like grin at the other players and give them like your most mischievous smile
Mm,
because of what you're about to do in the near future with the card that you've just drawn, that what it is and they don't know. And I think that is just a moment of fun. It's fun to
mm,
be in that position. It's fun to be on the other side of the table too, groaning about, oh no, like what did Brendan just draw? Oh no, Pete is about to absolutely demolish me. It seems based on that, and I have to kind of wait for the reveal to happen. I think that is something that adds a lot to the inherent kind of excitement, which is a lot of what we're
yeah.
talking about here of drawing cards when that's inserted into games.
It's a unique moment of connection between you and the other players, right? There's a reason why poker players often wear hats tilted down with glasses. It's an emotional experience drawing cards, and you can reveal something meaningful about what you're doing. So if people are playing poker professionally, just try to shut all of that down. But when you're playing for fun, it is a fun moment of unique communication that's happening, right? If you're playing with a friend, depending on how seriously you're taking the game, like you said, Jake, maybe there's moments where you just draw and you just smirk. You just have the biggest grimace on your face, and you're kind of toying with the people you're playing with. It's sort of like I know something that you don't know, or maybe you look really sad
Yeah,
and
it's um,
trick everyone.
it's a moment of expression, something that
Yes.
I loved your episode last week with Pete, and it really, this is a slight aside, made me think that's something we need to talk about on the show way
Mm,
more,
yeah.
because I mean, every time we're making decisions in games, that's what the show's about. We're expressing something. And I think that this kind of like drawing a card, getting that new piece of information is a prime opportunity to express something. And it works both ways, right? You can play that like shut it down. I don't want to express anything. But you can also tactically go the other way, right? You can, and there are poker players that have success making, being really demonstrative at the table, right? uh
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like commanding the table, talking with people to obscure what's happening, right? Like
Sure.
acting really chipper, demonstrating, expressing strength when they're
Yep.
bluffing. And you can do the same thing in games, right? Back in the day playing Magic, call them Jedi mind tricks, right? Where you would draw a card and present like that is exactly the instant spell you need. The combat trick that's going to blow up your opponent's board if they attack. All the while you're just sitting there praying that they don't attack you because you're just holding a land and
The top
acting
deck to
like
land, yeah.
yeah, acting like it's whatever. It's a great point of a great opportunity for expression that comes about from the simple act of drawing a card.
And I think a key thing about cards is that the technology of cards, and cards are a technology, a very old technology at this point, but cards didn't exist for a long time in human history, then became something that was easy to make because paper came into being. We could had printing technology to print on paper and mass produce them, but they're really good at this simple mechanical taking hidden information and transferring that hidden information to just one person. A die is cumbersome to do that, right? If someone's sitting rolling a d20 that's hidden, you can do that. Role playing players, I think, uh, I haven't played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, but sometimes a dungeon master will roll a die behind a screen, and I think you might have a similar social experience. But it's there's something for me that's missing when you put it behind a screen, right? When it's a shared object in the middle of the table that you reach out, you grab, it is that thing objectively, no matter what. Dice can't be bumped. You can't say it's something it's not one if you have to reveal it to use it. To me, it just mechanically, it's a very smooth moment. I don't know. Is there
Yeah.
something to that, Jake?
I think it's something that lives sort of in a weird place between like the mechanics of it, but also like the aesthetics of it,
Yeah,
where it's just really nice. Like cards are, crafted over a millennium to be like fun objects to hold in your hand, to like
yeah,
fan them out. They can be, we sort of have a sense now, I think, for what the ideal card size is for like an average humans hands. That's why
yeah.
like we people tend to find like mini cards so odious if they have to
Sure.
have a hand of mini cards, or even like tarot cards sometimes. Like I
Love
don't,
playing with tarot cards, right? A
yeah,
hand of tarot cards. No,
no,
not
I don't
gonna.
want that.
Yeah, I don't
Okay,
want
I
that
was like,
either.
okay, I was taken aback. I was like, I don't
No.
want that. I want the poker
Poker.
size cards.
Yeah.
Um, and I've joked with you because I know you love Babylonia, and my bit is that like I don't want a hand of tiles,
Yeah.
and it doesn't make me not like that game, but there is something to that where when I'm playing a game like Babylonia or like Tigris and Euphrates, like it is less satisfying to me to draw a
Yeah.
tile and kind of like put it on my like little dinky tile holder rack as opposed to having a hand of cards. And that really is a meaningful detriment to the game just for my personal enjoyment of it.
Yeah. Cards are not often, I mean, they can be, but not often fiddly. They work pretty well for what you want them to work for.
Yeah, the other thing that is good about them is like it's nice that I don't have to know what the text of your card says because it's in your hand. Like another thing I don't like in games, getting more
Mm,
into like the design stuff, is when there's like a display of cards that are like constantly coming out and the cards have a lot of text on them, so I'm like supposed to get up to like orient myself so I can read all the text on these cards so that I feel like I'm playing optimally. And it puts me in a weird place where I don't want to do that, but I
mm,
also, being a spiky player, it's important to me that I'm not intentionally playing suboptimally because of my own like laziness. And I think it a hand of hidden cards offloads a lot of that burden. Like you can just let it go. I only have to care about like these few things that I have, and helpfully they're in my hand. I can look at them anytime I want to consult them and remind myself what the cards that I'm holding say.
Yeah, absolutely. As we move on from this sort of cards are sneaky, you have hidden information, if it's a hidden information sort of card drawing game, um, there's a reason the phrase "I know something you don't know" is sort of this childhood taunt. And because it is innately fun to know things other people don't know. And when you get that little hit of information, it is an "I know something you don't know" moment. And it might not even matter, right? But for a moment, you get to feel powerful because of the potential of your hand containing something it doesn't, with your magic example. Um, yeah.
Uh,
Should we talk about the deck a little bit more? This is
about
sort of drawing through a deck and the
Yeah,
progress that drawing through a deck can create.
yeah, perfect. Let's do it.
Okay, so cards in I think that an important part of the fun of cards, Jake, is that when you first start playing, well, there's really two types of card games, right? Card games where you're intended to sort of know the makeup of your deck, right? A game like Keyforge, where there's 36 cards in the game, in a player's deck, and 12 from each of these three houses. That's a game that wants you to have a sense of the probabilities of drawing certain houses, and to be able to think of and really know all 36 of the cards in your deck, and make decisions based on it. And then there's games like, say, Arc Nova with a very large deck where it is a little bit more difficult to know what could actually be in that deck, and it's obfuscated. But I think in both games, the games that where it's obfuscated, as you draw, there's still this sort of infinite potential. I could maybe get what I need. And in games that have known probabilities, the smaller deck Keyforge example, um, you have this sense of progress where early on everything feels possible, and the more information you get, the more certainty you have. So with every draw, you know a little bit more about what's likely to happen. And I think that trajectory of uncertainty to certainty, right? When you're down to two cards, you know 50-50 chance of what you're going to draw. That's cool. There's something rewarding about that, that rewards the player for paying attention, rewards the player for understanding what's there, and is also fun, I think, to have the probability become more sure of at least you knowing what you're likely to draw.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Like I feel like we're moving a little bit maybe from like it, the fun kind of hitting you over the head and more to like why is this work?
Sure.
In a, perhaps like a less obvious way. It's a more
Yeah.
subtle thing, but I think you're right in that um, having a deck of cards, especially in a game where the game is driven by a deck of cards, um, like you it inherently gives you a sense of progress, whether
Mm,
it's a type of deck where you know what the cards roughly are and then you're like, okay, I'm waiting for this card, I'm either going to draw it or my opponent's going to draw it. I'm thinking of games like Lost Cities, right?
sure.
Or a lot of those Knizia games in that space, Schoten, Totten 2, etc., where you're like, that blue 10 is out there and either I'm going to get it or my opponent's going to get it. One of us is going to get it soon. And that's going to be a big deal.
Yeah.
And you're kind of like, have that increasing sense of pressure because you see that deck going down in front of you. Um, I think, but even in like an Arc Nova, right? Like, oh, we've gone through so many cards, right? It just gives you like a sense of progress that things are moving along, um, because we have this like central deck that we just see it diminishing.
Yeah. I think that there's also fun in that moment of, we've been talking a lot about, I hope I draw this card. But you can invert that and have, I hope I don't draw this card. So an example of that is, there's some games where if a certain card is revealed, the game will end immediately, right? Or maybe it will end after a round. So Enchanted Plumes, a card game that I designed, you have a card in the bottom 8 cards somewhere randomly within there. Whenever you draw, up till when you get towards that bottom 8 cards, it's sort of like, okay, the game's just progressing as normal. But then once you get so where the deck is pretty small, all of a sudden, if you're winning, you really hope you draw that card. And if you're behind and you need a few more turns to finish up your plans, you can end up with, I really hope I don't draw this card, and I really hope the opponent doesn't draw this card. And it just makes for a dramatic moment, sort of knowing that it's there. Um, Another good example is something like when you're playing Incan Gold, the revealing of the curses. It's that sort of same effect.
Yeah.
There's good and bad that could happen. I have mixed emotions about what the outcome could be.
High Society is another great one, right? Where the game timer is the deck itself. And I put this in the notes as sort of cards are a mean, but also an ends, right? Where there are games, right? It's exciting to draw cards because that's the good stuff that you're hoping to do, but it also could end the game or be bad. A really popular game that we haven't discussed on this podcast before that was brought up on the Discord by Wotes, WOJTS, is Exploding Kittens, where drawing cards is the good, fun stuff in the game. So it's exciting to draw cards, but it's also exciting because you could explode when you draw a card. So it's really, I think, a smart design thing that's leaning into the fun of drawing card, making it both like the exciting because it's good and exciting because you don't want the bad thing to happen by drawing card. And also, I want to add from our friend Aurora, who mentioned that her favorite thing about drawing cards is when she gets to draw her entire deck in Keyforge, which is possible with some like combo strategies. And I think that kind of fits into this drawing cards as a means, but also an ends, because it can just be the win condition for certain players, whether it's the specific cards like your key cheat or the whole deck to just put yourself in an insurmountable positive situation.
Yeah.
I think it's like an interesting mechanic where, it's rare. I think that's like, it's how you get there, but also can be how you end or win the game too.
I want to expand on that some too, because I think something key there is that one, cards are really affordable to produce, right? So cards are easy to make a lot of them. You could put 300 cards as a game and it's not going to be prohibitively expensive, whereas 300 plastic minis is really expensive. Um, and this is important for why cards can be fun, because in any card game, oftentimes there's an economy to how many cards you're getting access to in a turn, right? So it might be that you always draw one card. In a game like Lost Cities, you're always going to have the same number of cards in your hand, and you're always going to draw the same number of cards in a turn. This applies less in those types of games, right? I think in those types of games, it becomes more about the Lost Cities example. Am I going to get the right card? But there are other types of games, like say Carl Chudik's Innovation, where there are actions within the game that can allow you to draw more cards. So the baseline is I'm going to get I could draw maybe 2 cards a turn if I use my actions to draw those cards. But if I can set up the situation right, I have this moment of explosive growth where maybe all of a sudden I draw 20 cards or something to that effect. And those moments give you this really long bell curve on the possibility space of a game that cards are really good at making happen in a physical game environment, because they're affordable. It's easy to handle 20 cards comparatively to maybe 20 other pieces that you have to keep hidden, like in Babylonia, right? Those little tiles, they're more cumbersome. Getting 20 of those chits and seeing what they all show and finding the important one, if all 20 of them were different, is much more difficult of a task than drawing 20 cards into your hand and knowing, oh, this is the type of important card, or I need to be able to sort these in a meaningful way and keep them hidden. And I think that matters. It's easier to have this sort of gush of cards come into someone's hand and stay hidden information than it is a lot of other playing pieces. And that's fun.
Yeah,
Getting
great point.
one thing is fun. Getting a ton of things at once, it's not common to do that, is even more fun.
Totally.
Snow Day.
Okay, last thing I had on this side of the conversation for what makes card games fun, and we've talked about this a little bit, but I want to drive the point home. And this was brought up by Benjamin Ing in our Discord. We've mentioned them before on this podcast, and they said that drawing cards makes the game feel alive, creates the sense that anything can happen, and adds an inherent variability to the game, because every time, I saw the fun fact, right? That's like every time you shuffle a deck of playing cards, it's incredibly likely that you are creating a shuffled deck of cards that's never been created exactly the same way before.
Yeah. In human history.
Right, ever. Right, yeah.
Ever.
It's an almost impossibility that it would in fact be the same as any other shuffled deck. So that is something that is inherent to a deck of cards that's just really fun. It gives players just an unstated understanding that every time we play this game, it will be a different iteration of this game than has ever been played before. And that's something I think that's like just kind of a magic thing about
Mhm.
uh a little M magic, not a big M magic thing about a deck of cards.
Yeah. There it's a true statement. This is the type of math that's so difficult to wrap your head around, but there are more ways to shuffle a standard deck of playing cards than there are atoms on Earth.
Yeah, that
I
does
can't
sound not
it sounds
right.
like bullshit, but apparently it's right. Um, and I think that that's one of those things where it's, how can I contort my brain into understanding this? I can't. That's that possibility.
Yeah.
And I do
And
think, yeah,
that's just like the kind of like thing that's kind of, I don't know. It feels like it's like one of the things that's like around us. It's like physics that we have access to and we can cheaply put in a game.
yeah,
And so it's like almost like we should be doing that. So
yeah,
let's talk about some of this stuff doesn't need to be designed, right? It just is. Like that I think is why drawing cards in game is so universally adored. I'm excited for, those of you out there who's like, I actually hate when I draw a card in games. I only like uh abstract abstract zero luck games or whatever,
yeah.
to chime in the Discord. But I think universally an adored game mechanism, and so core to games that we don't even think about it as a mechanism, right? It's just like is a thing in games. So not all this needs to be designed. However, there's a lot of really interesting and fun design knobs that we can play with and think about, and understand, that influence the decision space in interesting ways about drawing cards in games. So let's turn to that for the second part of this conversation, how games are designed so that drawing cards is fun. And I think we have to start here, which is that we just have to say it, right? Drawing cards is an extreme form of input randomness, just like rolling dice. However, players tend to tolerate the former way more than the latter. Brendan, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think when you say players tend to tolerate the former rather than latter, you're mostly talking about sort of strategy Euro games, right? Where something like Garth Hill games, the sort of Shem Phillips games, like Raiders of the North Sea, or what's the other one, Jake, where you can capture someone's workers and you have
Oh,
your
Architects West Kingdom.
Architects of the West
But there's a
Kingdom.
million. There's a million of these
Sure.
games, right? Arc Nova, Terraforming Mars, Earth, like some of the
Yep.
biggest hits, Wingspan of
Innovation.
modern board games, all
Yep.
have this, and we don't think of them as like extreme input randomness games, even though in many ways they are. I think people tend to kind of gloss over it because we just accept it, right? It's just like there's a huge deck of cards. We're going to draw some of them and go from there. Whereas I think if those games, my hypothesis had a different form of input randomness, where it's like, okay, at the start of each round, we're going to each roll 4 dice, and we're going to use those to do our actions based on what the dice says. That makes that random input randomness core to both games. Like in the dice example, it feels so much more pertinent to the decision space.
Yeah. I think one of the things that can help is oftentimes in these types of games, Terraforming Mars, Race for the Galaxy, things like those, you're drawing a lot of cards. You're doing it a lot, which actually smooths the amount of randomness in the game. If everyone draws a lot of cards throughout the game, it is a less random game potentially than a game where, say, you're each going to draw one card in the game and then compare the value. That's a more random game than let's draw 20 cards from a deck, add up the values, right? Where if we have a standard 52 playing card deck of cards, we each draw one and compare. That's more variable than if we each drew 26 cards and added them up. We're much likely to have closer numbers if we each draw 26 over. And I have to think that that plays a role somewhat, but there's also just the cultural appetite for randomness in card games
Mm-hmm.
that is inherited in modern tabletop games from classic playing card games, right? This is a foregone conclusion that we accept that these games are fun, fair, etc., in a way that maybe if you just roll dice, it doesn't feel as fair?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know.
I'm a little bit begging the question with that prompt too, because there are also strategies that these modern games employ to mitigate the randomness.
Yeah.
Um, and I think as I talk through these, as we discuss these, I think maybe part of the reason it feels less random, even though you could use the same exact strategies with dice, is with the cards, you can print the mitigation right there. Like with dice, it would require external systems. Like I could, so for example, one of the ways to mitigate the randomness or make it feel more fair to players, just like giving them lots of hits.
Hmm.
So in Terraforming Mars, this example came to us from Varianor, friend of the show, on Discord. It's fun to draw cards because you're looking at a lot of different things, and it's very likely that in some way it might help you. Right? It might have a tag that you're looking for, because this has like a set collection type element with tags. It might have an effect that's going to help your position in the game, and it might have like a cost that you can afford amongst the different types of resources in the game too. So instead of just being a single thing, cards can provide many different things simultaneously, and at least increasing the odds that at least one of those things is something that the player drawing it is looking for.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Multi-use cards are popular for a reason. I think people often cite, if not drawing cards, right? I really love games that allow multi-use cards, and that has a sort of mitigating effect that, oh, I'll be able to make the most of anything that I draw. And I think for at least some modern hobby style games, that can help blunt the blow of input randomness. Oh, there's always something I can do with this, right? If it's a game that allows that.
Yeah. Jimmy DM90 mentions Marvel Champions as a game where
Mm,
cards are both a card but also a resource. I think that was most famously popularized in Race for the Galaxy.
yep.
Um, and then there's also just forms of like extreme multi-use cards, like in Glory to Rome, where every single card could be used in like one of four different
Mm,
ways. So I think that's a good strategy. And then the last thing I had listed here for kind of mitigating that input randomness feeling is giving players agency over when to draw cards, and that's something that you mentioned in innovation, but like giving player, I think that is a really important knob that designers could turn to make a game feel significantly less random, because then no matter what the outcome is, if I'm the one who's chose to draw a card,
mm,
I have accepted that risk, right?
yeah.
And it makes the result, whether good or bad, feel much more earned than if the game just says at the start of your turn, draw a card.
Definitely. I also think there's something to the fact that that shifting scale of likelihood of what's in the deck, right? If you roll a d20, you're just as likely when you roll the dice the second time to roll whatever number you rolled. You always have a 1 in 20 chance of rolling a 7 when you roll a d20. But if I'm drawing from a deck of 20 cards, if I draw that are 1 through 20, if I draw the 7, I know I'm not drawing it again. And so I think because you can have a shifting scale and knowing the potential of what you could draw based on what's already been drawn, that it helps it make it feel less random, even though, say, 1/20th and 1/19th of a 1 out of 19 chance are pretty similar numbers, you know? But it's just even that slow progress psychologically, I think helps.
Yeah, right. And you could also combine multiple of these strategies, right? Like if you give players agency over when to draw cards and design a deck in a way that's really easy to track the information, then
Yep.
you can kind of give players the opportunity to say like now is when I feel comfortable expending my resources to draw cards.
Yep.
Um have you ever played Netrunner, Brendan?
No.
I haven't either, but I just think this is, Richard Garfield, one of our collective favorite designers, and Spalding in the Discord mentioned this as one of their favorite iterations of drawing cards. I just think it's really interesting asymmetric design. So one player is like the runner, one player is the corporation, and in Netrunner you have 4 action points. You can use an action point to draw a card, And
Mhm.
there are other games that use similar thing. I think your Enchanted Plumes is one. Arkham Horror, the living card game, is one. So that's like giving you a lot of agency over like
Yeah.
when and how much you want to draw cards. But with the asymmetric approach, uh, the corporation gets the the runner player gets 4 action points, um, but the corporation gets only 3, but are always drawing a card at the beginning of their turn.
Mm,
So
interesting.
it forces progress in the game on one side, but not the other. I think
I
that's
think
really interesting.
I think that's really interesting too, because part of the fun there is that it becomes a quandary of, are my cards good enough? Right? You're forced to then consider what could happen, the possibility of drawing an even better card versus, can I make do with what I have? Is there a better way to spend my resources? And I think that that mirrors in some ways, decks are an object to think about, that there's clarity around. And I think that that knob is really key. So we talked to just pivot us again back into that conversation around what can make card games fun. Either knowing exactly what you could draw, that's like the puzzle cards as puzzle pieces, right? A game where all the pieces are different and there's one piece that you need to fit into the game situation. So that feels like hitting a jackpot if you get the right piece at the right time. So that's one side of it. You can have really clear probabilities, have players be able to understand those probabilities, know that there's an unlikely chance, but to have right pieces. That way, when they draw those pieces, it feels great. And then on the very other side, you could just completely obfuscate the probabilities, have it be a very large deck that where almost anything feels possible because you have different rules on all of the different cards in the game. Something like Arc Nova, where just it always feels possible that you could come back because knowing every single thing that's in the deck feels unlikely. So because of the game design, it's almost as if the structure of the game, the designer is telling you, hey, it's possible you could come back. There might be something in here good enough that they could help you. I think that's more of this illusory design that can help players feel a confidence to keep playing when actually in reality you might have already been put in a position where you can't win, but it almost doesn't matter because you're just told not to think about it, but told that in a way that typically as a player I'm willing to buy into.
Yeah, there's all kinds of kind of different stratification on how much the designer wants you to know about the game, right?
Yeah.
Um, so we talked about Magic, right? Presumably, you know exactly
What's
what's
in
in
your
your
deck?
deck because you've built it yourself, but don't know anything about your opponent's deck. In Arc Nova, or maybe you start thinking if you're like a competitive player, right? Maybe or even a casual player, you're playing as your friend. You may don't know exactly their deck, but as they start playing cards, you can make some logical deductions about stuff that you might encounter, or in like a limited setting.
Sure.
Um, in Arc Nova, right? You don't know what's in the deck at all. The more you play it, the more familiar you are. Obviously, probably the highest elo players on Board Game Arena know the whole deck, but whatever. We're not really interested in that. But the deck is also designed in a way that you can make some assumptions about
Yeah.
what might be in there, right? If I draw a card that says collect 3 bear cards, like I know there are bear cards in the deck,
Sure.
even if I haven't seen them. So even a deck that I think that doesn't want you or doesn't ask that you know exactly what all the cards are and all their costs and all their text, um, can still be cleverly designed in a way that is cluing players in who are paying attention to some of that fun inherent to like drawing cards, which means that you have to have some knowledge. Some of that narrative we talked about in the fun side of this episode like requires you have some knowledge of like what is a possible hit and
Yeah.
what is a possible miss. So I think
Yep.
even decks that you don't know, we want to design them in a way that all players get to enjoy some of that kind of excitement, fun. Um, and then the last one I wanted to bring up was like in deck building games. This occupies such a weird place for me in this conversation because I actually don't really like deck building games, and you know, thinking maybe exploring that a little bit in this episode. But like, it's in this weird place where everybody's deck to start, but then they become different over time, but maybe at a rate that you could still like know what people have to some
Hmm.
extent, and then you're like going through half your deck on every turn. So I bring them up because it's definitely like a card driven game where drawing cards is important, but for whatever reason, it's missing a lot of like the magic and excitement and fun about drawing cards for me that exists in almost all these other types of games.
I want to interrogate that and then talk about what I think deck building games do really well, despite not doing this. And I think what you lose, Jake, in some ways, is you take that fun arc and you say, we're going to do that arc 20 times in a game. And the fun arc being having a deck, drawing through the deck of cards, seeing the order that that deck was in. There's, jumping off a bridge into a river is fun if it's safe. It can be exhilarating, but it's probably more
You're
fun the
doing it, I'm
first
doing it.
time. Yeah, more fun the first time maybe than the 20th time in one day, right? There's even with fun things, if you do them enough times, they stop being as much fun. And I think that that arc becomes less interesting if you're doing it 20 times in one game and you get to have a really innate sense of things. So for me, that might be
Yeah,
explaining part of it.
I think that's a great point, and also that it's like at the start, it's not jumping off the bridge. It's like I don't know, like stepping
Dipping
in
your
a
toe into
puddle.
water. Yeah,
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 like
yeah. What I think deck building games do really well is synergies. So part of the reason drawing cards can be fun in games, period, and one of the things that designers can play with is that cards, because they can be relatively rules dense for a game playing piece, can interact with and form relationships with other pieces, I think, in a more nuanced way than other game pieces, right? The tiles in Babylonia have less space and can convey less information because they're smaller and more cumbersome than a playing card that you can put language on, that you can put images on, maybe a lot of images, a lot of tags, like something like Terraforming Mars. And because of that, when you draw a card, drawing that card, one, we've talked about, oh, I get to do this cool new action because I drew this card, but it can also mean, oh, this card in my hand just got way better. I brought these two pieces together and I made this synergistic combo. So drawing a card can, on one hand, give you new things and make the things in your hand already better. And other pieces can do that, but I think the relationship between card pieces can be relatively nuanced because of how much you can put into them. You can make them pretty different, which without creating too much of a burden for the players, either, mechanically at least. And I think that for me, part of the fun of deck building is seeing how those synergies come together, right? How can I draw a perfect hand that lets me have some explosive piece? It's unlikely, but I brought these cards together. Will I get the draw at the right time that
yeah.
lets me do this fun thing?
I think that's a great point, right? It leans into what we talked about. It's like card games, drawing cards can make you feel powerful. I
Yeah.
think it's like focusing more on that, perhaps at the expense of some of the other aspects of that, like narrative curve, whatever.
Yeah.
It's a great point. Brendan, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Do you like to draw your card at the beginning of your turn or the end of your turn? Because
Definitely the end.
so this is another knob that we can turn, which is
Yeah.
like as designers and games make different choices. Like when do you draw that card? So why do you like drawing at the end more than the beginning?
So I feel this is sort of the common knowledge about this is, or the common opinion tends to be, it's best to draw cards when you will have lag time between when you draw it and when you will make decision. So that can be passive thinking time for the player, right? If I draw my card at the start of my turn, everyone else is waiting for me to make a decision with new information that I've just gathered. So everyone else has to sit and wait while I think about what I'm going to do with this new information that I had. Whereas if I draw at the end, I get new information. During everyone else's turn, I can think about what I want to do with that new information, and the game state might be changing, but I'm playing with that idea in my head. Versus if I draw at the start, everyone has to sit there and watch me figure out what happens. What do you think for you?
Yeah, I like drawing at the beginning of my turn,
Okay, why?
but it depends, I guess, on like I would if I'm drawing like Keyforge, you refill your hand, right? You might be drawing three or
Yeah.
four cards. In like a deck building game, you draw like six cards. Really lame. Everybody agrees. Uh, but I think my favorite, uh, you know, iteration of this mechanism of drawing cards is still like goes back to Magic the Gathering of like drawing that one really crucial card at the beginning of your turn. And I think the reason that has advantages, and we still see this in other games like the Schoten Totten line of games. I think JC in our Discord mentioned these as a good example of drawing cards early or at the beginning of your turn, is that like it makes you feel excited for your turn the whole time. If I didn't draw if I missed on my draw at the end of my turn, that's a bummer. And then I get to see my opponent do something good or cool, and knowing I'm not going to be able to do anything good or cool on my turn, that is less fun experience than hoping that I'll draw the exact card I need to answer it on my turn at the start of my turn and then be able to do that. So even if there might be slightly more downtime in the game, I think it's actually like more fun to
Draw
sit
at the
through it
start.
if I'm drawing at the start of my turn.
Yeah, that's a really interesting, good point, because the potential is still always there until you draw the cards,
Right.
based on what we said previously. Yeah. Interesting. I like games, Jake, that allow you to keep drawing until you bust or something to that effect. And that's in the notes here too. But I think that mechanism can be incredibly fun. Something like, I mentioned it already, but Ink and Gold, where you are forced to, it's a great mechanism for creating moments of hubris and greed and testing you on it of, have I done enough? And in that game, it directly pits you against other players where there's this shared pool of resources that you can leave and safely exit with some percentage of them, or you can stay in as more and more accumulates. It's like playing blackjack as a table. It's kind of fun.
Yeah, I like this too. There's a couple of great, if lesser known, Knizia games that I've played that do this. One is called Circus Flocati,
Yeah.
and the other one's Medici, the card game. And in both those games, you're basically revealing cards from the top of the deck until you choose to stop, or you keep going until you bust. I think this mechanism works really well too. You maybe lose out on a little bit of like that fun sneakiness, but it adds even more, drama, I think, to an already fun mechanism of drawing cards. It's like I want, because it just plays with like that tension between the inherent fun, like the fun thing is drawing cards.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think like the hubris there works really well, because eventually you have to say, okay, that's enough for me. I've had my fun this round.
Yeah. This is an interesting next point of, a lot of card games have different costs associated with using those cards, right? So they're going to give you access to a certain number of cards, but maybe there's limits to when and how you can use them, which is this sort of design innovation that allows designers to make better or worse things. So that's speaking very broad terms.
Yeah.
But in Magic, you get to have cards that are incredibly powerful and might completely reshape the game, but they can be fair because they might cost 9 mana, which is
Right.
huge.
You have
There's
a
a
card that
card,
literally says you can't lose the game
yeah,
if you have it in
sure.
play.
Yeah, or there's
What
a
card were
card
you
that
going to say?
there was a card called Omniscience that was recently printed, Jake, that's 7 blue, 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 I believe, and it just says now you can play cards for free.
That's
That's
amazing.
really amazing, right? Completely game breaking. But it allows you to have balance while still creating this sort of broad range. And that's really about costing. But I
Mm-hmm.
think that becomes fun because then when you draw, what matters, and it emphasizes that. But the flip side is something like Keyforge, where cards have no cost to play. You just can only play one of the 3 houses of cards in your deck, the 3 types of cards on a given turn. So it gives you this sort of overreaching management puzzle. And that can be fun too, where you're sort of using this other resource, the probability of drawing certain cards versus how many cards you get to play on a turn based on what's in your hand. It becomes this puzzle affixed to it. I don't know. I think that card costing is fun because it can create fairness in a game playing environment, even though all of the pieces are otherwise equal in a fairly nuanced way. Obviously, you can do
Right.
that with other mechanisms, but it works really well here because the density of information on a card can be relatively high and still be easy to
Yeah.
interact with.
Right. It enables like variety in impact of the card in a way
Yep.
that I think is difficult to do in other type of components or mechanisms. Like
Yeah.
generally, I think games try to balance their effects.
Sure.
and
Yeah.
and cost is just a really simple knob to balance wildly different effects.
Yeah. It'd be really
Uh,
hard to create a D20 with 20 different images on it, right?
right.
Where each image had some different effect. You would just use numbers. And then it's less thematic, it's less engaging. Yeah. This next knob is really interesting.
Yeah, this is the last one I had, which is how many copies do you want to have of a card in your deck? And I think there are two different things happening as you make this decision. So on the low end, right, if you choose to have one copy of a card, it increases the randomness of your game, but also increases the scarcity of a game. So uh, it makes that one card when you draw it, that's it, right? So it makes it feel incredibly precious to you, and especially in games where you can pair this with other types of mechanisms we've talked about, right? Like using cards as a resource, right? If cards are your resource in the game and there's only one copy of the card, that means every time you're using a card to pay for anything or you're playing anything, you're also burning the only instance of something that exists in the game. I think this. I didn't write it down. I feel bad, but somebody mentioned brass. I think brass has like couple copies of each card, but you also have to use cards to pay for things. So it's like creates an agonizing decision for players as they're deciding like what to pitch, to move somewhere else. Put a piece on the board. It's been a while since I've played brass. I'll be honest with you, but like that sense of scarcity is something that is really prominent based on the number of each card possible in the deck.
In Challengers, a game that we both really enjoy, there's different numbers of copies of most cards have 3 copies in any given deck. There's 3 decks in that game, deck A, B, and C. 4 copies? Are you sure?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
The rare cards have 3, except for in the C deck, and they have 2.
Thank you. AI? What about AI? Does AI has 3 copies? Yeah.
If it's rare, yeah.
And then there's Skeletons, which have 5 copies or something like that, or
8.
even more than 5. 8 copies. Great. But this brings this to the forefront, right? Of when you draw an AI, which is this card that's more limited in the weaker deck, it feels exciting that you might have the potential to use that. Another thing that comes to mind for me, Jake, is to just bring us full circle with Yu-Gi-Oh! The scarcity piece is emphasized in that show with, I'm curious if this is going to be in your mind, Exodia. So Exodia is this mechanism in this game, is this character that has 5 different cards. And in the main character's deck, he has Exodia. So you have like the left leg of Exodia, the right leg of Exodia, the left arm, the right arm, and the head. And these are all 5 different pieces. And you bring all 5 together.
Very interesting anatomy, this Exodia.
Yeah. Why nobody? You immediately win the game. I don't even know if mechanically that's how Exodia works, but that's how it's presented in the story. Right. And I think it's playing with this idea of scarcity, this idea of bringing pieces together that we've been discussing. It's a nice sort of touchstone.
I think that's exactly how it works in the game too, right? It's an instant win, which is another way that like you can balance these like crazy effects too.
Yeah.
Which I'm glad you remind me of, like, without cost, is by just making it really unlikely that they would all come together. And you could do that by having a big deck and needing multiple cards to have a combo. So there's other ways to balance these wildly powerful instant win effects beyond just making the card cost a lot. And I think in this case it's free, but you just have to have the incredibly unlikely thing of drawing them all at once. Or Magic has, what's it called? Battle of Wits, where it's like you win the game, but you only win the game if there are 250 cards in your deck or something.
Or more. Yeah.
When you play it.
Yeah.
So thereby playing with that very idea of balancing through uncertainty, which is really interesting.
The flip side of this.
Flip side, you talk about it.
Well, I was just say the flip side is as you have more cards, the predictability of drawing those cards increases. So designers can play with having lots of copies of a certain card. We sort of refer to this of Skeleton, right? In Challengers. I know it's more likely I'm going to draw this slightly below average card because there's more in the deck, but at least I know there's a chance I'm going to draw it. Or something like Magic the Gathering, where roughly, a third of your deck are land cards that are typically, I mean, you can break this up. You can play more than one color. But let's say we're playing with a single color. Roughly a third of my deck is lands that are functionally all the same. They are mountains. I need those. And then 2/3 of my deck are all unique. Then all of a sudden you're juggling these probabilities. You have this relative predictability around drawing land. Millions of players who have been Mana Screwed are screaming out in agony as I'm saying predictability, talking about this mechanism. But I think that that's important, is that there's ways in which you can add nuance to the predictability of drawing cards from a face down deck that can make them fun, where you can have both predictability and unpredictability, what
Yeah.
feels like scarcity and randomness in the same deck. That's really hard. That's possible with a D20, right? A third of what's on it has this effect, 2/3 has this other. But I think you feel it more with a deck of cards for somebody. I don't know why I keep saying you feel it more.
Well,
For me, it's more emotional. I don't
it
know.
is. There is, and I think moving into kind of closing thoughts here, I think like part of what is fun about this is kind of something that's like innately magic about it, right? Like the physics, the math behind it, the fact
Mm-hmm.
that every time we're shuffling a deck of cards, we're getting a new iteration of that, right? Making that magic deck where it's like I should be drawing lands a third of the time feel very alive, because in practice you may draw 20 cards that are all lands to
Yeah,
start the
sure.
game. And sometimes it really feels like that, and that feels bad in the moment. And we might even talk about how, card game design has moved beyond that, because we can create mechanisms that smooth out that player experience. um, but the fact that Magic has predictability of drawing lands,
Mm,
unpredictability of drawing cards, mixed together with the just vast amounts of unpredictability of what happens when we shuffle 60 cards together, is something that I think makes it stand the test of time more so than anything else about it, right? It's like
yeah.
it really feels like when we're talking about drawing cards, we talk about our feelings, our emotions of it, because it really feels like art mixed with science.
Yeah. Something to kind of bring that point home, Jake, is one of the reasons I love cards, yeah, I think is the ritual of using cards as game pieces. Shuffling a deck of cards is a really unique skill. It's there for me, riffle shuffling a deck is fun. It's enjoyable. Someone might just sit around and practice riffle shuffling and get good at the skill of riffle shuffling. That's also, there's a legacy to riffle shuffling. If to hand someone a deck of cards who had never seen a deck of cards before, and you said randomize this collection of things, I don't think many of them would think, oh, I'll just shuffle them together using a riffle shuffle, right? That's knowledge that you have about this collection of objects. That's a skill that you've been taught. My grandma taught me to riffle shuffle cards. And I bet all of you who are listening to this episode can remember who taught you to shuffle cards, how old you were, maybe even what table you were at. For me, learning to shuffle cards creates the potential for cards to be drawn, and took effort for me to learn how to do that. It felt special when I learned how to shuffle cards. And it takes setup. You have to prepare. And then again, unlike dice, it is known. Versus, rolling a die is it's much more obvious. But I think the ritual of, okay, give me all the cards, I'm going to put them all face down. I'm going to riffle shuffle them a few times, cutting a deck. There's all these conventions to how we might randomize a deck of cards that feels like a shared language that to me make me feel a little bit like part of a club of people who love playing cards, in the way that there's this shared culture that is physical, that is innate and basic, is how it feels to me as someone who enjoys and loves card playing. And every time I go and I play a game with a deck of cards in which I shuffle them, I am bringing back positive memories about playing card games, about shuffling cards, about learning to shuffle cards. If that was a positive experience for someone, which for me it is, that I think there is an innate joy to me to interacting with these objects for all of the reasons we've talked about art, but also those sort of ritualistic elements. And if you don't tell someone how to use cards in your game, if you give someone a game that has cards in them, um, without any other input, they're probably going to collect them, make sure they all have backs that are face down, shuffle them, and put them in the middle of the table without any instruction, because it is so ingrained that that's the ritual of how you use the cards, even if it's not intended. So if you don't use them that way, you almost have an uphill battle.
Yeah, yeah. That's I We could do a whole episode on shuffling cards, I
Sure.
think. Like, it's just like talking about, like, pile shuffling versus not, like cutting the deck versus not.
Mass shuffling, making a big pile and kind of pushing them together.
How many times have you ever heard that you have to riffle shuffle a deck 7 times to randomize it?
I've often heard 8.
I've heard 7.
Heard 7. Okay. It doesn't feel like enough in practice, but remember, every time you shuffle the deck, you're likely to have created there's so many potential outcomes, right?
Like,
That the likelihood.
you are, but like you're still keeping cards close together in clumps, right?
It's true. It's because we've played too many games of Magic, so we know
Yeah.
that just shuffling once, you're gonna end up with all your
It's
lands
like those
together.
lands are still together. I'm gonna get
Yeah.
a pocket of lands.
Exactly. Can't risk it.
All right. Well, this has been a super fun conversation, Brendan.
Yeah.
Thank you for having it with me. I loved it. I hope people enjoyed listening to it at home.
Yeah, likewise. I wish in my life, Jake, there was always the clarity that could come from knowing what I could draw in a deck of cards and just finding it. And I think cards, in some way, will always have this sort of bringing chaos into clarity, that it's innately pleasurable. So, yeah, for me, that epitomizes the fun of drawing cards. But I hope people have enjoyed it too. And I hope you'll come talk with us in our Discord, which you can find a link to in our show notes.
We'll talk about it. Thanks as always to Hembry for our intro and outro song. Reach out. And until next week, I hope you find a great line and then draw the perfect card at the right moment.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.